The icy wind whipped through the crypts beneath Winterfell, as a faint rumble echoed beneath the stone walls. It began as a whisper, almost indistinguishable. But then the stone slabs atop the old tombs began to shift, crack, and tremble. The darkness felt deeper, heavier, and then through the chill, a faint glimmer of pale blue light flickered through the crypt's passages. Something was waking. Far below in the ancestral tomb of the Starks, the great slab covering Eddard Stark's crypt began to slide. A skeletal hand, rigid and brittle, pressed itself upward. Bones, draped in fragments of old leather and chain, clawed at soil and rock. The dead man rose. Ned Stark stood. His cloak, tattered and moth-eaten, hung like a ghost's remnant. His eyes, dim with centuries of silence, glowed faintly. The crypt's torches flickered, guttered in fear. The air smelled of damp stone, decay, and something old and terrible. A whisper of wind stirred, and with it came the distant echo of horns, as though distant trumpets from across the realm heralded a return no living man had foreseen. Outside, in the courtyard of Winterfell, the Stark banners snapped in the wind. Sansa, Arya, Bran, and Jon had come to pay their respects to their ancestors. As the moon hung low, the ground trembled. The youngest Stark, Arya, paused, blade half drawn. She felt it first, a chill in her bones. Not the cold stones beneath her feet, but something beyond. The earth groaned. The crypt's entrance exploded in stone, revealing gaping cracks that spilled with icy air. From the darkness came shapes, pale forms, shadowed silhouettes that moved with purpose, dragging themselves into existence, silent, spectral, crawling toward the night. At once, Jon Snow shouted, "Stand back." He charged in, long claw in hand, steps echoing. The ghost army surged. Ned's voice, hollow yet firm, called out, "Children of my blood, rise." His tone echoed in every corner, a command that cut deeper than steel. The apparitions halted. The flickering torches cast long shadows that danced like restless spirits. Sansa cried out, "What sorcery is this?" But even as fear gripped her throat, she could not deny the shape of her father before her, risen from dust. Every eye turned, every heart froze. Jon lowered his sword, uncertain. Bran, perched near the crypt's rim, whispered, "Father, is that you?" The ghostly figure of Ned moved forward, his ribs like ivory bars, his face skeletal but commanding. The dead army behind him pressed, spectral arms raised, lined up in ragged rows. The crypt's pillars trembled under their weight. He strode outside, each step shaking stone and soil. His cloak snapped in the wind as he joined his children in the open air, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "Westeros must answer for its betrayals." A howl burst from the night. Wildlings and northern outposts felt it. A tremor, a gasp in the dark sky. Rumors would spread. The crypts at Winterfell have given rise to the dead. The ancient wards, the old magics, long thought broken or powerless, something awakened them again. The siblings, stunned, watched as their father raised his spectral hand. "I will lead them," Ned declared, voice echoing across stone walls and cold air. "Justice must march. The realm must tremble." Jon, stepping forward despite his fear, asked, "Father, how? Why now?" The skeletal visage turned to him. "Because Winterfell bled too long. Because the North was dishonored. Because your duty faltered when I could not stand by." An icy wind whispered through the assembled. Behind Ned, the dead hoisted spectral weapons, rusted swords, broken spears, shields cracked and faded. They glowed faintly, not with fire but with purpose. The army of the lost had awakened. Sansa's eyes brimmed with tears as she approached, voice shaking. "Father, but you're dead. This is madness." The shades behind her flickered. Ned's hollow voice softened, though no warmth reached his bones. "I died because honor failed. I was buried in lies. But lies have consequences. The blood of Winterfell cries out, and now I answer." Jon's breath came fast. He glanced at Arya and Bran. They felt it too, the weight of legacy, the echoes of betrayal, the insistence that something broken must be mended. Far to the south, in King's Landing, the Red Keep slept under candles and whispers. But those whispers would shatter. Messengers riding through the night would speak of shadows marching north, of bones rising in the snow. Lords would tremble. King's Council would blink at reports of phantom banners flying above Winterfell. The small folk in fur cloaks would whisper among hearths. Was it a curse, a dream, a prophecy fulfilled? Yet the signs would mount, the dead walk again. In the crypt's entrails, Ned's army gathered. He turned to them, voice echoing, "You gave your lives for this land. Now you rise to serve it still." Spectral forms saluted in unison. Then, stepping forward, the ghost of Eddard Stark, once Warden of the North, took control. His bones rattled with unspoken grief. He raised his voice, commanding, "To the gates of Winterfell. We reclaim what was lost. We march for justice." Outside, the Starks watched, hearts pounding. The night air crackled with power. The wind howled like a chorus of wailing ghosts. The moon dimmed behind clouds. The dead surged forward, stepping across the courtyard in formation. The living backed away in awe and terror. Swords were drawn, shields held. Jon, every bit a Stark too, advanced beside his risen father, steel in one hand, resolve in the other, and in that moment the realm changed. The North felt it deep in its bones. The old magic stirred. The living and the dead stood together, united by purpose. The story of Westeros would never be the same again. Westeros would never be the same again. Snow fell harder now, coating the courtyard in layers of white as the dead marched in silence beneath Winterfell's dark sky. Their footsteps made no sound, yet each one echoed in the hearts of the living. The undead army, once loyal bannermen, northern warriors, and forgotten ancestors, moved with terrifying coordination. At their head walked Ned Stark, the dead man who once knelt before Robert Baratheon, who'd been betrayed in the south, who now returned not for revenge, but for reckoning. The chill that clung to him was not just death. It was purpose. It was justice sharpened into something colder than Valyrian steel. Jon Snow stood beside him, still alive but nearly breathless, as if standing in the presence of something that did not belong in this world, was draining the life from him. "Where are we going?" he asked, but the dead didn't answer. Ned's gaze turned south, eyes hollow and glowing, and his mouth moved without breath. "To those who betrayed the North, to the ones who forgot honor." His skeletal jaw clicked as he spoke, like bones grinding against forgotten truths. "To King's Landing." Arya's hand drifted to her blade. She didn't move like someone unsure of what side she stood on. She moved like someone already deciding who she'd kill, if this all turned. "You want war?" she said, quiet but deadly. "Dead men don't make peace." Bran, eyes distant as always, simply stared at the army as if he'd seen this before. Maybe he had. Maybe this was the price of knowing too much. Inside Winterfell's great hall, Sansa sat with Maester Vulcan and the remaining northern lords, who whispered like frightened birds. "We cannot allow the dead to command armies," Lord Glover hissed, his hands trembling. "It's unnatural. It's a curse." But Sansa, shaken as she was, kept her voice steady. "And what would you have us do? Tell our father to lie down in his grave again?" Her words were sharp as icicles, but her eyes betrayed the storm inside. This wasn't her father. It couldn't be. And yet, he remembered. He spoke with the weight of the man who'd raised her, bled for her, died for her. If ghosts could return to defend their blood, maybe the world was more broken than she ever feared. By morning, the undead host stood outside the gates. Over 300 spirits now, some whole, some half-rotted, some clad in rusted armor still bearing House Stark's sigil. The sky was iron grey, the air unbreathably cold. Ned raised his skeletal hand, and the gates of Winterfell groaned open. No battle, no conquest. A march, southward. Jon rode beside him, black cloak flapping behind him. He had no words for what he was part of, only instinct. Somewhere in him, he feared this was the beginning of something worse than any White Walker. Because this army wasn't mindless. It was intentional. It remembered. The news traveled faster than ravens. A dead lord raised from the grave with an army behind him? Whispers became wildfire. In White Harbor, people boarded ships. In the Twins, the Frey bannermen spoke of ancestral vengeance. In the Riverlands, Tully banners were quietly unfurled again. The North was rising, but not in rebellion. In mourning. It was a kingdom led by a ghost with a crown of snow and silence. At Castle Black, the few remaining brothers of the Night's Watch watched with dread as word came north. "The dead march south," one said to Sam Tarly, his face pale. Sam shook his head, heart racing. "No, this isn't the Night King. This is worse. This is personal." In King's Landing, Queen Daenerys Targaryen sat on the Iron Throne, flame at her fingertips and blood in her memory. She had known loss, betrayal, fire. She'd thought she understood death. But when the reports came in, first dismissed, then confirmed, her hands tightened around the armrests of the throne. "Ned Stark is dead," she said. "This is a lie." Tyrion, ever the realist, poured a goblet of wine with shaking fingers. "It may be a lie," he said, "but the people believe it. And in Westeros, that's just as dangerous." The small council convened in panic. Varys, already half faded into his whispers, said simply, "The North is moving, and the dead don't negotiate." Dany's blood boiled. "Then I'll burn them." But even as she spoke, doubt crept into her voice. The North had already burned once, and it had only made them harder to kill. Back on the King's Road, the army moved. Jon tried to reason with Ned, tried to speak to whatever soul still existed beneath those bones. "There's still hope for peace," he said. "You don't need to bring war." But Ned's reply was as cold as the wind that carried it. There is no peace without truth, and the South was built on lies. At night, the camp was filled with unnatural silence. The dead didn't eat, didn't sleep. They simply stood, armor creaking like whispers of old sins. Arya watched them from the edge of the campfire. She didn't sleep either. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes were sharp. She had killed death once. She could do it again if she had to. Bran spoke little, his visions tangled. But one night he said something that made Arya freeze. "The gods didn't raise him," he whispered. "Something older did," she pressed him. "What do you mean?" But he only shook his head. He's not the only one waking. As they passed villages, some peasants knelt. Others ran. The weight of the North's dead was not something any soul could ignore. Children cried. Old men whispered that the long night never ended. It only changed form. Jon began to doubt. Each day he rode beside his father. Each day he saw less humanity in him. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't mad. But he wasn't alive. He didn't laugh. Didn't reflect. He just remembered. "You were a good man," Jon said once, voice cracking. "You taught me about honor." Ned turned his glowing eyes toward him. "Honor is what brought me here, and now it brings them judgment." South of the Neck, the first confrontation came. A Lannister patrol, 50 riders in crimson, tried to block the road. They never stood a chance. The dead surged with silent rage. No screams, no fire, just steel and shadows. When it was over, not a single rider stood. Jon arrived too late to stop it. He stared at the bodies, stunned. The blood froze in pools. Arya stepped beside him. "This isn't justice," she muttered. "This is punishment." The army grew. Every battlefield they passed, every unmarked grave added to their number. Not all rose, but enough did. The dead followed Ned's banner like moths to a forgotten flame. Westeros was bleeding again, not from fire or politics, but from history clawing its way out of the earth. When they reached Harrenhal, the ghosts wailed. Something ancient had died there, and something remembered. Ned stood among the broken towers and whispered names no one else heard. Benjen, Lyanna, Catelyn. The names drifted into the night like smoke, and one by one shadows stirred. Far to the south, Cersei Lannister, exiled and forgotten, heard of the marching dead. She laughed, bitter and wild. "Let them come," she said to no one. "Let them all come. I buried him once," but her hands trembled, and in her dreams she saw blue eyes in a face she once mocked. The Lion was no longer queen. The dead didn't care for crowns. They cared for balance, and behind all of it something darker waited. Not the Night King, not the Lord of Light, but something older, something watching. Jon finally confronted Ned one stormy night. Lightning cracked above them. "This ends in fire," Jon said, "so you know that." But Ned just looked past him. "All things end in fire. But first comes truth," and so they marched. Truth, and so they marched. As the undead army descended past Harrenhal, their numbers swelled like a plague with purpose. With every ruined village, forgotten battlefield, and desecrated tomb, they grew. Ghosts, wights, and skeletal warriors formed tight phalanxes behind their spectral commander. But this wasn't chaos, not like the Night King's horde. These dead followed order, memory, grievance, and their commander, once Warden of the North, once the quiet heartbeat of Winterfell, was no longer merely a man who rose from the grave. Ned Stark had become something else entirely, a vessel of ancestral fury. Jon rode beside him still, but the distance between the living and the dead widened with every mile. He tried to speak with Ned every night, tried to reach the man buried beneath bone and frost. "We can't keep doing this," he said one night, firelight flickering across his face. "You're not avenging the North anymore. You're dragging the whole realm into a grave with you." But Ned's head turned slowly, blue eyes glowing beneath his brow. "The realm built its throne on graves," he said. "Let it feel the weight of them. Behind them, the Stark dead weren't just soldiers. They were children, mothers, lords forgotten in the dust of history," and still more followed. At the back of the march, Arya lingered, quieter now, but always watching. She had whispered Bran's words to Jon days ago. Something old awoke him. She hadn't said it aloud, but the truth gnawed at her. What if this wasn't even her father anymore? Bran had stopped speaking altogether. His eyes stayed pale and distant, lost in visions he refused to share. Every night he sat in stillness, watching the wind, watching the trees. Once Arya approached him in the dark. "Do you see how it ends?" she asked. Bran nodded. "He sees everything," he replied, and Arya's hand moved to her blade. The Riverlands fell quiet as the dead passed. No one dared oppose them. In Riverrun, the Tully banners were hoisted again, and Edmure, long shamed and forgotten, stood on the ramparts in disbelief. "That's him," he said, his voice thin with awe and terror. "That's Ned." But the silence of the army chilled him. No chants, no war cries, just footsteps and wind. He turned to his advisers. "Do we bend the knee to a corpse?" And no one had the answer. Daenerys, still seated on the Iron Throne, was losing sleep. Her armies were tired, her dragons restless. Drogon snapped at shadows and circled above the Red Keep, like a caged god. "If they march here, I'll burn them to ash," she swore to Tyrion. "Let fire cleanse the dead." But Tyrion's voice was hollow. "And if fire no longer stops them?" he asked. "And what then?" Varys reappeared after weeks of silence, a scroll in hand, eyes wide. They passed the ruins of Harrenhal. "The castle screamed," he said. "The screams were heard as far as Maidenpool. The dead are angry, my queen. And they remember everything. Sansa had taken control of the north in her father's absence, or rather in his ghost's advance. She kept Winterfell calm, but her letters south grew colder. "You burned our home. You betrayed our blood," she wrote to the queen. "You should be the one buried, not him." Her words stung like ice, but even Daenerys knew the realm was shifting. People spoke less of dragons and more of ghosts now. Of retribution. Of judgment long deferred. The Golden Company, finally recovered from its earlier failures, had been stationed near Blackwater Bay. They were ordered to intercept the army near the ruins of the Trident. But when they saw the dead crossing the same river where Rhaegar Targaryen had fallen, many broke ranks and fled. "It's the old gods," some cried. "We're fighting death itself." At the head of the army, Ned stopped at the Trident and fell silent. The ghosts behind him slowed. He looked into the water, as though seeing something lost long ago. "I buried my sister here," he said to Jon, his voice trembling for the first time since he rose. "The South took everything from us. And you still wear its crown," Jon bristled. "I wear it because someone has to," he snapped. "Someone alive. Someone with mercy." But the silence that followed crushed his voice. Ned didn't reply. He turned away. The march resumed. In King's Landing, chaos bloomed like fire. People fled the city in waves. Whispers of the dead coming to reclaim the throne spread faster than plague. Mothers wept. Priests chanted. Some even began praying to the old gods again, hoping they might be spared. Daenerys watched from her tower and felt a terrible thing, not fear but doubt. Tyrion approached her with one final plea. "Let me speak with them," he said, "before you burn everything." She agreed reluctantly. "But if they threaten the city, I will not hesitate." And so Tyrion rode north with a white flag. He met Jon at the Stormlands, just as the army camped for the night. The ground around them felt wrong, too still. The grass hadn't moved in hours. "You should turn back," Jon warned. "This isn't your fight anymore." But Tyrion laughed bitterly. "It always is, Jon. Every man I've served has died chasing peace." "Your father, he's not chasing peace." Tyrion stood before Ned that night. The two men, opposites in life, now met again, one dead, one carrying the ghosts of his own choices. "You don't have to do this," Tyrion said. "You're not saving the realm. You're haunting it." But Ned's voice was cold. "The realm murdered honor. Now it must answer." "You'll destroy everything," Tyrion warned. "And what's left? A kingdom of bones." Ned turned and walked away. By the time the army reached the Blackwater Rush, Daenerys had made her decision. She mounted Drogon. The skies burned. And from above the Queen of Fire came to meet the King of the Grave. Flames rained down, but the fire didn't stop them. Drogon screeched in rage, circling back, but the dead marched forward, unaffected by dragonfire. Daenerys screamed into the wind, confused, furious. The dead had walked through winter once. Now they walked through fire. Jon stood beneath his father, stunned. He'd believed fire was the last line, the final boundary. But when even fire gave way, he understood. This wasn't just vengeance. It was punishment on a scale the gods themselves had abandoned. And Ned, finally looking up at the burning sky, whispered something no one but Jon heard. Now they'll listen. Jon heard. Now they'll listen. Ash rained down like snow as King's Landing braced itself for death. The army of the dead had reached the gates. Not the pale, mindless horde of the Night King, but something older, something colder. They didn't moan. They didn't scream. They stood in silence, rows of broken armor and hollow eyes, watching the capital that had once betrayed their commander and murdered his honor. Behind them, thousands more now marched. Tully ghosts, old kings of winter, even a few Baratheons whose bones had been rotting since Robert's rebellion. The very history of Westeros stood outside the walls, not as a memory but as punishment. Ned Stark stood at their head, still silent, still watching. His sword, once shattered in Baelor's sept, had been reforged in the cold of the grave. It glowed faintly, not with flame but with truth. That was his weapon now, the truth of every lie that built the Iron Throne. Jon Snow stood beside him, flesh and blood among the dead. Torn. He had marched all this way, hoping to stop something darker, something out of control. But now he feared he had helped create it. He turned to his father once more, desperation leaking through his voice. You've proven your point. They fear you now. The South will never forget this. But Ned's jaw barely moved. Fear is not enough. Fear can be twisted. Only reckoning is final. Inside the Red Keep, Daenerys stood at the battlements. Drogon circled above, smoke rising from his nostrils. She looked down at the city she had fought for, bled for, burned for, and now death stood at her gates again. Wearing the face of the man who once tried to stop war, not bring it, Tyrion stood at her side, eyes hollow. If you burn them again, he said, you'll become what you always feared. Dany didn't look at him. Then tell me what I should do. Let them take the city? Her voice cracked. Let a ghost rule Westeros. They don't want to rule, he whispered. They want you to remember. The bells rang not because of surrender, but because something had shifted, something ancient. From beneath the Red Keep, stone cracked. The old skulls of dragons began to rattle. Spirits moved where even fire dared not burn. Somewhere in the dark, Balerian's skull split open, long dead eyes glowing faintly for the first time in centuries, and Bran Stark opened his own. Back in the army's rear, Bran sat still, eyes rolled back. His voice, long silent, suddenly boomed across the camp in a whisper that reached every soul. He is not just our father. He is a gate. Arya heard it first. She ran to him, blade drawn. A gate to what? But Bran's eyes filled with black. Not white, not blue, but the shadow of memory itself. The old gods are watching, and through him they rise. In the capital, screams began before anything moved. Civilians ran not because they saw monsters, but because they felt them. The air had weight now. Shadows walked without shapes. The godswood, long burned and forgotten, bloomed with blood-red leaves. The weirwoods whispered again. Ned raised his sword and the gates opened, not by force, not by siege. They opened because the guards stepped aside. Some knelt, some fled, some simply dropped their weapons and wept. The city had broken itself once with fire. Now it broke again with silence. Daenerys stood before her throne waiting. Waiting for the dead, waiting for justice, waiting for the truth she'd buried when she burned the city. And then he entered, Ned Stark, armor cracked, sword silent. He walked across the floor of the throne room where his blood had once stained the stones, where lies had been born, where kings had broken oaths, where fire had replaced honor. He looked at her, not with hate, not even with anger, just with judgment. Do you remember my words? He asked. She tried to stand taller. I am queen. I brought peace. No, he said. You brought ash. I warned them once. I begged them to see what was coming. No one listened. Her lip trembled. You're not even alive. I am what they made me, Ned replied. What you made me? what the throne made of us all. Then Jon stepped forward. Between them. "It ends here," he said. "No more fire, no more bones, no more ghosts leading men to die." But Dany didn't listen. Her hand moved, Drogon roared, and Arya was already moving, steel. Flashed, blood sprayed, and the Queen of Ashes fell at the feet of the dead. Silence followed. Even Drogon didn't scream. He simply watched as his rider's blood soaked the throne she had loved more than life itself. Then, with a cry that shook the Red Keep, he rose, snatched Daenerys' body, and flew into the ash-filled sky. Gone. Forever. Jon dropped to his knees. Ned turned away. And outside, the dead began to vanish, one by one. The Tully ghosts faded at the river. The Stark ancestors whispered to the wind and disappeared. The ancient kings bowed to the north and were gone until only one figure remained, Ned. He looked at Jon, at Arya, at Bran, at Sansa, who had just arrived at the gates. "You've seen what happens when we forget," he said. "Do not forget again." Jon stepped forward, eyes blurred with tears. "Stay." But Ned shook his head. "I can't, I never could." And as dawn broke, Eddard Stark, the man who had died for honor, who had risen for justice, vanished with the light, leaving behind no crown, no throne, just memory, and the warning, honor always returns. Even from the grave. Even from the grave. The silence that followed Ned Stark's disappearance stretched across the Seven Kingdoms like a funeral shroud. The dawn that broke over King's Landing was unlike any before, quiet, golden, but steeped in something unnatural. There were no horns, no declarations, no bells for the fallen queen. Her throne sat vacant, stained with blood that had not yet dried. The dragon was gone. The dead had left no trace. Only the living remained, and they looked more broken than victorious. Jon Snow stood in the great hall where Daenerys had died. The blade Arya had thrust into her still lay on the floor, slick and silver, like a quiet confession. Jon hadn't stopped her. He hadn't raised a hand. He'd watched as the last fire-born monarch collapsed beneath the weight of her own ambition. And now he stood, not as a king, not even as a leader, but as a man who realized too late that no one had won. Arya was the first to leave. She said nothing to Jon, gave no explanation. Her eyes were hollow, jaw tight. She walked from the Red Keep with her head low, and didn't stop until the streets swallowed her whole. Some said she disappeared from Westeros entirely, boarding a ship west. Others claimed they saw her on the King's Road, blade in hand, chasing whispers of another war. But none knew for sure. Not even Jon Bran remained behind, seated in the council chamber, flanked by lords who no longer knew whom to serve. He was silent for hours, watching the ravens outside circle above the scorched city. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, detached. "The wheel is broken, but the realm is cracked underneath. Something has to be built, or it will rise again." No one knew what he meant. Not Tyrion. Not Davos. Not Samwell, who returned days later with ashes on his boots and scrolls in his arms. But they all agreed on one thing. There could be no more thrones. No more Targaryens. No more divine bloodlines. And still the people were afraid. They whispered of the dead who walked, of Ned Stark's eyes. Not blue like the Night King's, but something older, heavier. Of how his army moved with purpose, not hunger. How they vanished only after Daenerys fell. Some began to believe he wasn't just a man returned, but a punishment sent by the gods, a northern reckoning. A ghost of honor itself, and in Winterfell Sansa Stark ruled in solemn quiet. She received the news of her father's second death, if it could even be called that, with no tears. Just a long silence and then a single command: bury no statues, leave the crypt open. Some protested, but she was firm. "Let it remain empty," she said. "He already came home once. If he must, he will again." Jon did not return north. He stayed in King's Landing, not as ruler, but as prisoner of duty. The council had voted not to crown a king or queen, but to appoint a council of 6, voices from each major region. A compromise. A band-aid on a wound too deep for stitching, but the realm had no appetite for more crowns. They had seen too much. The Iron Throne, melted by Drogon's fury, had become a monument of failure. Twisted steel, shattered legacy. Some wanted it reforged. Others wanted it buried. Jon said nothing. His nights were haunted. Not by Dany or even Arya, but by Ned. He saw him in dreams, walking halls of stone, staring at Jon with eyes that glowed not with death, but disappointment. "You let me return," he'd say. "You let me become that," and Jon would wake up shaking. Every raven that arrived carried conflicting tales. In the Vale, some swore Catelyn Stark was seen walking barefoot through the fog, a cold wind always at her back. In the Riverlands, the dead of the Red Wedding were said to rise from the twins, and in Dawn, children spoke of sandstorms that whispered old northern names. Sam tried to dismiss them. "Fear makes ghosts out of rumors," he said, but even he didn't believe it. The world had changed, not with dragons, not with kings, but with the return of memory, of truth, of consequence, and no one was ready. One night Bran called for Jon. They hadn't spoken since the gates opened. "You saw what he became," Bran said without preamble. Jon nodded. He was more than himself. Bran tilted his head. He was never just himself. None of us are. We carry the past. He carried it too far. Jon leaned forward. Why did it let him rise? What force brings back a dead man for vengeance? Bran was silent. Then he said, "What if it's not a force, but a wound? Deep enough, long enough, and it doesn't heal. It reopens, it rots, and it remembers." Jon shivered. "Then it wasn't just about us." "No," Bran whispered. "It was about all of them." The next day, a raven arrived from Old Town. The Maesters had unearthed records from before Aegon's conquest, records of a time when the old gods walked freely, when they demanded balance, when betrayal, especially of blood, did not simply fade. Jon read the scroll twice. Then he burned it, too late now. Elsewhere in the north, the forests thickened. The trees turned redder, the winds colder. Some swore the weirwoods wept at night. Some swore they spoke. Children of the forest were seen once again in dreams and visions. Not playful, not wise, angry. The world didn't move on, it never does. It simply waits for memory to return. And Ned Stark was just the first. Winter never truly ended. Even as spring crept across the land and the snows melted in the south, the north remained cold. The trees near the wall groaned in the wind, and the night fort, long abandoned, echoed with the sound of footsteps no man could trace. Not human ones, at least. The old gods had awoken once, and their presence still lingered like breath on glass, invisible but undeniable. Jon Snow rode north alone. He said nothing to the council. No farewells, no explanations. He simply left. Some whispered he went to escape judgment. Others believed he was going to find redemption. But none knew what truly drove him except one. Bran, the king in all but name. Bran had watched him leave with neither approval nor protest. He knew that Jon wasn't going to find peace. He was going to face what was left behind. The final debt. The wound still bleeding under the snow. The Night's Watch had scattered after the long night. There were no more wildlings to fight, no more White Walkers to stop. Yet the wall still stood, and so did the darkness beyond it. When Jon reached Castle Black, he found it empty. Ghost greeted him first, silent, loyal as ever, eyes gleaming with that same primal knowledge. Together they passed through the shattered gate, into the lands where snow never fully melted and night never really ended. The memories haunted Jon more than the cold. He thought of Daenerys, how her eyes went wide as Arya's blade pierced her chest. He thought of Ned and how his silence weighed heavier than any roar, and he thought of himself, a man born of fire and ice, who had killed, who had knelt, who had died, who had returned. But for what? He didn't have answers. He only had footsteps. And ahead, beyond the frost-bitten trees, something moved, not wights, not walkers, something older. The godswood here had grown dense, unnatural. Weirwood faces twisted into snarls. Red sap bled like open wounds. Jon stepped into the clearing where the old heart tree stood. Massive, gnarled, its face carved deep and cruel. He dropped to one knee. "I don't know what you are," he said aloud, breath curling in the air. "I don't know what you want, but I know you brought him back, and I need to know why." The wind didn't answer. The trees did. Their limbs creaked. Their leaves hissed. A low guttural sound filled the air, and the snow at Jon's feet turned black with memory. He saw the first men breaking the forests. He saw the children of the forest weeping as their magic was stolen. He saw oaths broken, between houses, between brothers, between gods. He saw Winterfell burning. He saw the Sept exploding. He saw babies born with lies wrapped around their names, and he saw Ned Stark's head fall again, then rise. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. Truth must walk when the living forget. Jon stood, sword drawn. You used him. The voice replied, he was chosen. Because he remembered. Because he never broke. Jon's grip tightened. So you turned him into a weapon? No, the voice said. You all did. The storm broke above them. Thunder cracked. Lightning lit the woods with brief, hellish clarity. And Jon saw them, standing at the tree line. Not wights. Not shadows, faces, dozens of them. Stark ancestors. River kings. Forgotten queens. Their eyes glowed red like the trees, not blue like the dead. They weren't walking corpses. They were memories, solidified, bound in shape. Alive only by the force of what had been stolen from them. One stepped forward, tall, cloaked, his face stitched with scars. Brandon the Builder. Another, a woman in fur, eyes sharp as glass. Lyanna Stark, a boy with a direwolf pelt and blood dripping from a sword. Rob. Jon fell to his knees again. I buried you all. Lyanna knelt beside him. Her voice was colder than any blade. You buried lies, not truth, and the realm still lives off the bones of what it won't confess. Rob stepped forward. I was supposed to save us, Jon whispered. I tried. Brandon the Builder towered over them. Then try again. The forest vanished. Jon awoke near the wall, alone. But something had changed. He looked at his hands, and for a moment, just a moment, his shadow stretched longer than it should have. He was not just flesh anymore. He had been marked, not cursed. Not blessed, remembered, and south of the wall. The world spun on. The great council dissolved. The 6 kingdoms fractured again. Sansa kept the North sovereign. The Vale followed, choosing no lord. Dawn remained quiet. The Reach returned to farming, ignoring letters. The Westerlands fell into infighting and King's Landing. Rebuilt, but it wasn't the same. The throne room was empty, always. No iron throne, no fire. No crown, just a banner of grey and white, the direwolf, a reminder. Every year a rider came from the north, not to collect taxes, not to make laws, to listen, to remember. Because now the kingdoms feared not kings, but forgetting, and they feared that if they did, honor would rise again, clad in ice and bone, wielding memory sharper than any blade, and it would not ask for peace, only justice, only justice.